Hey, and welcome to the first session of my Cinema4D Fundamental series. We're beginning with the user interface today, and this is really meant to be a quick start guide for everyone who's new to Cinema4D. We'll pretty much jump right into it, and attached to this video you will also find a little PDF document with all the images you see right here. This is just an overview for you so that you can better remember and understand the basic layout of Cinema4D. I also attached a few rather important shortcuts for you. There are of course a lot of more shortcuts for you to find out, but those are the most important ones, I think. Okay, so let's jump into Cinema4D. We will pretty much go over every detail right here in the user interface, and we do this in a clockwise kind of way. So we start off with the menu bar up here, and this is pretty much like a menu bar you would expect from any kind of software. You find kind of everything in here, and we don't want to bother too much with this for right now. In the beginning you will pretty much find your way around Cinema4D without going into detail up here. So right beneath your menu bar you have your, I would like to call it the control bar, with the most important elements to work with in your everyday life of Cinema4D. I just skip over to this little button over here so that we have something to work with in our viewport. So by clicking here, I'm just adding a cube to the scene. And now you also see, when you have a look right to the top left again, that now this back button appears. So right here you can like undo and redo kind of things you do in Cinema. Okay. The next thing is the live selection tool. And the live selection tool is basically the default tool you use in Cinema4D. With the tool you can select your objects in your scene. There are a couple of different possibilities to select here. So whenever you see this little black arrow in some of those buttons, you can click and hold your mouse and select another mode for that tool. We just stay with the live selection tool. The other tools are pretty much self-explanatory, I think. So the next one of those yellow ones here is the move tool. With the move tool you can pretty much move the objects around in your scene. We also have a scaling possibility, and of course we can also rotate around the different axes in our scene. Right next to that we have like a history of tools we have selected. So whenever I want to come back to a tool I selected previously, I can just use this menu to exit it quickly. Now these three buttons right here are used to disable certain axes. So I have the move tool selected, and when I now go ahead and deactivate, for example, the X and Z axis, and I now click anywhere in my viewport and move my mouse around, you see that the cube is only moved in the Y direction. Now reset that back to default. Now when I activate all the other axes and I click anywhere in my scene, you see that I can move the cube on all axes. So sometimes it's useful to only use one of those axes whenever you like to move things around. But on the other hand, you are also free to use just the handles as well. The next thing is the coordinate system switch. When you're working in a 3D software, you basically have two different kind of working modes concerning your coordinate system. So what you see right here is now the local coordinate system. And if I go ahead and I have to activate those buttons again. If I go ahead and rotate my cube a little bit, and I then go back to my move tool, you see that the axes of my cube are rotated as well. This is of course useful because now I can move the cube in, for example, this direction, and this is called the local coordinate system of the cube. But sometimes it's useful to switch back to the world coordinate system. And so if I click here, this is what Cinema does. It's now in the world coordinate system. And I now can move the cube in the world coordinate system. So the world coordinate system will never change. It will always stay the same like this. But my local coordinate system depends on the parameters of my object. For example, right now I have rotated it. And again, I just reset my cube to the default. Now let's have a look at the next 3 buttons right here. The first one is used to render your current view just into the viewport. If I click it, you see now my view is rendered. There are a couple of different ways to render your image. One of the most important ones is to render your image to the picture viewer. And this is what this button right here does. So it renders my picture right to the picture viewer. The picture viewer is basically a place where all your rendered images are placed. You have like an history overview of all your renderings, and from there on you can save your rendered images to your hard drive. We'll go into detail again on the picture viewer in a later session. You can also use the render region function. And you're doing that by clicking and holding your mouse and define an area in your viewport which you like to be rendered. You can also add an interactive render region, and the interactive render region is pretty much the same than the normal render region, but it has the advantage of that you can choose the quality of your rendering. So whenever you have a more sophisticated scene to render, and it takes too long to render by using the render region, you can use the interactive render region and just use this little arrow right here to define in which quality your render region should be rendered. So, and the next button is the render settings. So right here you can change the settings for your renderings. For example, we could change the size of the renderings which are outputted by the picture viewer. We can add a number of effects to our renderings, and we have a lot of different options right here. We go into those in another session. You already learned about the parametric cube I added right here, and you find a lot of more of those objects if you click and hold your mouse over this little blue cube. All these objects you find here are parametric. This means you have these little orange handles on your objects, and you can click and hold to change the parameters of your object. So on every object you add, let me add a sphere for example, you have a different number of those handles, and you can change therefore the parameters of that object. So let me go ahead and add a pyramid. Right here you can see I can change the height and also the other parameters of this pyramid. Now the next 4 buttons are basically used if you want to model something. We will skip this for now, we will cover those in another session. The button over here is for scene elements, and for example you could add a floor to your scene, and the special thing about the floor is that it's basically a floor which is infinitive. So right now you only see that it's going up to this edge right here. But if I go ahead and render my image, you see that it goes right up to the horizon. You find a couple of other elements right here. We'll also cover this in another session. Well, let's talk a little bit about cameras before we actually go into detail about this camera settings right here. You have by default a camera in Cinema4D, but it's not shown up right here in your objects. It's called the default camera. You can move this camera around in different kind of ways. For example, you can pan around, you can zoom, and you can rotate. And I'm just clicking, holding, and moving my mouse again to do all those functions right here. You can also use the keyboard shortcuts 1, 2, and 3 for doing the same thing. So 1 is panning, 2 is zooming, and number 3 is rotating. Now, let me actually add a camera now. So whenever I add a camera, we have now a camera attached to our scene, and if you zoom out a little bit, you can see it right here. So we're still in the default camera right now. But if I want to switch to my edit camera right here, I have to click on this little black icon right over here. And now this behaves exactly the same like the default camera. One thing though to remember is that whenever this little icon over here is white, you're still in that camera. So once in a while, make sure to leave that camera again. Or if you, for example, if you're happy with the perspective and if you want to capture the scene on a certain angle or from a certain position and you're happy with it, you just have to click again and then your camera stays at this position. There are different kind of other cameras, but this is also something for another session. The next thing is the lighting tools. You find a couple of different lights right here. We have the point light, which is like the simplest form of light. We have a spotlight. This is pretty much like a spotlight you know of from theater or something like that. We have a target light, which always shines at a certain target you define. We have an area light, which is pretty much like, or could be compared to TV light or how a TV works. IS light you will probably not use unless you want to go into architectural visualizations and you want to use the manufacturer data of light manufacturers. We have an infinite light, which is pretty much like in sunlight, but if we want to add in sunlight, we actually have a special sunlight. But those two are pretty much the same. We'll go into detail in a later session when we're covering lighting. Okay, now let's have a look at our viewport right here. So you actually already know that we can move our camera around, we zoom, we can rotate, and so on. But we can do more. We can, for example, change some settings right here of our viewport. You find under the filter tab a couple of options which are pretty much all of them are activated. But for example, if you want to turn out the default grid of your scene, you can just deactivate it. Sometimes it's in your way and it's useful to hide it. To activate it again, just open it up again and activate it again. Now another kind of useful thing to know is that you can change the displaying of your objects, or how the way of how your objects are displayed in the viewport. And the most important one is the grow out shading lines. And what you see right now is that every object has kind of an outline, and this outline is actually displaying the number of polygons or surfaces each of our objects has. If I select the cube right here, I can also change the number of those segments or those polygons. It's not important or not too important right now, but something to keep in mind for working later on. I just go back to the go route shading without lines. Another thing which you can do with your viewport is to separate it into different layouts or into different views. You can just do that by click that button over here, and now you see that our viewport is separated into 4 different kind of views, and each view shows a different perspective. Right here we have our default perspective. Over here we have a perspective from the top, right here from the right side, and this is from the front side. To scale up one of those views, you can just use the button on each of those screens. And if I want to go back to my default perspective view, I just click right here. Now you can also change the perspective of your current view by open up this menu. And for example, I can go into the top view right here, or I can just switch back to the perspective view. The switch of views is important if you go into modeling or if you want to build up a scene, and sometimes the 3D view is not really helping you. It's rather in your way, and therefore you want to switch perspectives sometimes. Now let's have a look at all the other elements right here in Cinema4D. On the top right you have the object manager, and basically all the other layout elements right here are called managers. The object manager is, as you can see, a place where all the objects which are in our scene are placed in. An important feature about the object manager is his hierarchy capability. So for example, you can select a couple of objects, like the objects right here in our scene, and you can go to Objects, Group Objects, or use the shortcut Alt-G. Now I can move the null object, or it's now called the null object, and I can use this to move all my objects around. I don't have to select now all the 3 objects by itself anymore. I can just select the null object. If I want to move this sphere by its own, for example, I can just select it, move it around, and if I go back to my null object again, I can now use this to move all 3 objects at once. You can also subgroup a certain object with another one. So for example, I can drag and drop this sphere under the cube, and now the sphere is a child of the cube. And whenever I move my cube, this sphere will also move as well. So right here on the bottom you have the attributes manager. And the attributes manager is actually a place where all the settings of your selected tool or objects can be changed. So now, right now I have the cube selected, so I can change the parameters of, or you can also set the attributes of my cube. Now I've selected the sphere, and now I can change the parameters of my sphere. This attributes manager works pretty much for every tool you have selected. So for example, if I go back to my live selection tool, you see now the attributes of that. Next to the attributes manager is the coordinates manager. Here you can basically change the position, scaling, and rotation of your objects, but you find those settings as well in the attributes manager if you go to the coordinates tab. And I would recommend to rather use this one right here. On the top left we have the materials manager, and to add a new material to it we can just double click on the empty space, and now we have created a new material. You can open it up and then, for example, change the color of the material. And to add your material to an object, you can just drag and drop it to your viewport. Now, because the sphere is a child element of our cube, the material is also applied to the sphere. Now, if I move the sphere out of the cube, you see that the material is now not applied to it anymore. We'll cover the materials, of course, in another session in more detail. Now let's cover the last part of the Cinema4D layout right here. One important thing to understand about Cinema4D is how it handles its objects. So each object has basically two different kind of states. We already talked about the parametric objects right here, and they're still in their initial state. But we can change that by hitting this button over here. I now made the cube editable, and by that I changed it to a polygon object. So we don't have those orange handles anymore, and we cannot change the attributes or the parameters of that cube. But we have a lot of more possibilities right now to change the appearance of our cube. And to do that, we have a couple of different working modes. We have, for example, the point mode, and right now you see that all the polygons or the points of our polygons are displayed. I can select each point and move it like our object before in our 3D space. I can also do that in the edge mode, but now I can select a couple of edges, for example, and move those. Or I can go to the surface mode and select surfaces of my cube. So this is something which would not be possible when this object was still in its parametric state. All the other things right here are not so important for right now. We'll cover them when we go into modeling a little bit more. One thing to remember is that if you want to move your object again, you have to go back to your modeling object mode. And now Cinema4D is in the model mode again, and I can change the position of my objects. Okay, thank you. That's it for the first lesson. I hope you got a basic understanding of the user interface of Cinema4D, and see you next time.